Hi, I'm Dana Caspersen, and I'm about to have a productive conversation with Mike Vardy.
Welcome to A Productive Conversation. I'm Mike Vardy. My guest today is Dana Caspersen, a conflict engagement specialist, TEDx speaker, best-selling author, and award-winning performing artist. She's the author of the new book, Conflict is an Opportunity, 20 Fundamental Decisions for Navigating Difficult Times, and I was thrilled to talk with her about why conflict isn't something to avoid, it's something to navigate. Dana draws from decades of experience as a mediator and performer to show how our daily decisions around conflict shape not only our relationships, but our productivity and well being. We explore why complaints and demands don't create change, how assumptions fuel reactivity, and what it means to listen when you least feel like doing so. Oh, and if you're someone who loves to turn systems into checklists, we touch on that too. So let's get into it. Dana, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today. Really appreciate it. We are going to
Pleasure to be here.
we're going to talk about the book Conflict is an Opportunity, 20 Fundamental Decisions for Navigating Difficult Times. And when, first off, for those that don't know, haven't come across your work before, again, we lean more obviously into the podcast around time management, personal productivity. People are like, well, why are we going to be talking about conflict today? So we'll get into that. But first, if you could share a little bit about yourself, and I know this is a pretty trite question that you get asked, but what led you to writing this book?
Yeah. So I work in conflict in a number of different ways with individuals and organizations and communities. I have a background as a performing artist, and I got into it because there was so many conflicts in so many areas of my life, and I thought, there's just got to be a better way to do this. And one of the things, kind of getting back to what you mentioned about time management, is that I noticed that people think either I just can't deal with the conflict or there's no time to deal with this. We just need to get this done.
Right.
When in fact, if we don't deal with it, then we really have time problems down the line and productivity problems.
So around procrastination in that area, what are one of the leading reasons that you've discovered, or maybe one that one wouldn't think of that leads to kind of this, let's push it off to the side and keep forging ahead regardless of the conflict? What's something that people really need to watch out for when it comes to this so that it doesn't short circuit their ability to, stay productive?
Yeah, there's often an assumption that bringing up the issue will make everything worse or drag everything down. And the difference there is whether you bring up the topic in a way that includes attack or sneaky strategies trying to get your own way,
Hmm.
or whether you bring up the topic as something that's a question between you that you're both going to be working on, and it holds together the interests that people have on both sides. Then it becomes not a frightening place, not a problematic place, but a place that people can, in a certain way, even though it's not always easy, they can relax a bit because they recognize that their interests are being spoken to. And then then a conversation becomes possible that's not just about fighting back and forth about strategies.
I want to get into those fundamental elements in conflict, but I want to touch on attention because that's what drove, like, as soon as I opened the book, I'm
Mm.
like, oh, attention. What are you paying attention to? So on and so forth. Um, I wonder if, and again, as many people who listen to the show know that we don't tend to go in a linear fashion when we discuss books or anything like that. But
Mm.
one of the things that came to mind almost immediately was this idea of identity and focusing our attention on the identity of the person that you're either in conflict with, or, and rather than looking at like assuming that their identity is rooted in whatever the conflict is about. I'm wondering if that is an area where like, what is something, if that is something that you've discovered that people kind of latch on to or kind of pay attention to, what are some of the things that people can do to kind of keep themselves from going down that path?
Yeah, I think when you're thinking about a person that you're in conflict with, to take a step back and say, "What do I assume about them?" And when you don't have real data of any kind, ask, find out. Don't act upon suspected data because a lot of times it's inaccurate. And also to recognize that it's often really not helpful at all to start talking about what you think how someone else's personality should change. And in fact, also to put that toward yourself, to recognize that a lot of times people think, okay, that's just how I am. I just freak out in a conflict or whatever it is. But to recognize that what we have done and what other people have done in the past is not what they are. That's just what we or they have done. So the moment where we can open the space up to say, we can acknowledge the things that happened that we don't appreciate. For example, when this happened, I experienced this because this is important to me. I'm wanting to better understand what your thinking is around this, what your experience is. Can we sit down and have a conversation around this? So that rather than starting to pre-attack someone in your mind, that you keep your own mindset stronger and freer by staying curious until you really get a sense of what's happening in the
I was
situation.
Yeah, I was going to get to that because it comes back to that, that scene in Ted Lasso, be curious, not judgmental, be curious, not judgmental. Like, if you,
Yeah.
that scene to this day to me, I know the quote isn't exactly a Walt Whitman quote. It just made for nice storytelling. But nonetheless, I thought that was interesting. Another thing that I found interesting, and this kind of, I only came across this yesterday, actually, was Amy Poehler has a podcast called Good Hang, and she was talking to Paul Rudd. And she actually asked him about conflict, like in confrontation, like how he handles it.
Hmm.
And he paused because I don't think, and first off, it looked like he certainly didn't think about it. Um, how important is it for us to actually step back, like you pointed out, and think about how we handle and approach conflict? I'll give you a quick example from my own life. Is when my wife and I got together, and we've been married for over 20 years now, it took me a while to realize that my version of yelling and her version of yelling are very different. So I grew up in a household where yelling was loud, amplified, right?
Hmm.
And so when I yelled for her, which she didn't grow up in a household like that,
Hmm.
even me toning it down because I didn't want to have the same experience, it still felt elevated to her. And it took me a while to go to kind of recognize that, oh, we have different experiences here and I need to be mindful of that. And
Hmm.
she was mindful of it too. But it was very interesting because I thought about how I didn't want to be based on what was going on in my own household growing up, but I didn't know how that, even me downplaying it or as far as I'm concerned, reducing how I handle it or making changes still would feel very almost aggressive to somebody else. But to me, it felt less so. Do you see where I'm
Hmm.
getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that example. That's great. Because what you're naming there was two different conflict cultures that you both came from. And you come together and then you create a new conflict culture. But when we don't have awareness of the characteristics of the culture, how much we've internalized that, like you say, even if there's parts of it that you don't want to carry on, somehow there's still a little imprint that gets into us that feels like it's normal or feels like that's the way things are. And so really taking a step back and especially in long-term relationships, whether it's personal or at work, to say, okay, let's just take a second and check in how people feel around conflict. What are the things that make it harder for you to engage? What are the things that help you? So that we start to understand that when people respond or when we respond, there's a big, long history behind us that's partly shaping that, unless we're very conscious and we can say, "Woo, okay, I feel my habit coming on here." It's not that the habits will instantly go away, but that we can then consciously have alternative responses if I find myself wanting to shout, because it just feels like I should shout, to say, okay, I recognize that that's a strategy that was utilized in my family. I'm going to choose an alternative strategy that's going to work with the conflict culture I want to be part of with my wife, for example,
Right.
so that our conflict cultures are not, uh, they're not permanent, and they are things that are connected to what matter to us, but they're often overlaid with what we've experienced and what we have unconsciously taken on.
It to go back to the whole Paul Rudd, Amy Poehler interview, it was rather interesting when she said, like, "Do you yell?" And then he spoke up, but he didn't yell. She goes, "Whoa, whoa, you don't have to yell." Like, so they performed it a bit, and it was very interesting to watch how I watched it. I'm going, this is not yelling, but it showed the nuance involved, and this is actually really interesting when you go back to those four fundamental elements in conflict,
Mm,
because when I looked at them, they they definitely have nuance involved, right? Like, I want
mhm,
you to go through them because, needs, I always kind of, whenever I hear the term needs, I go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and so on and so forth. But
mhm,
emotions plays a role in there. And this is obviously alluding to what I talked about with myself. We're like, oh, I feel bad. I don't know what's
mhm.
wrong. I don't think I'm doing it. And then again, the interest, which I mean, you've kind of compartmentalized this in your previous answer before, but the idea of interests and then strategies. Can you go through these
Yeah.
fundamental elements for those that may want to approach this, again, like you pointed out, from either a personal standpoint or a professional one?
Yeah, absolutely. So, getting back to this idea of attention, to become aware of these 4 elements, which are always present in every conflict, and being able to consciously direct our attention is incredibly helpful because often what we do in a conflict is jump straight up to that strategy level. This should happen or this should happen. And I used to start because I do a lot of trainings, I used to start with needs, try to get right in there. But it's very difficult to start with needs because we're as a culture, we're really not accustomed to sitting down and thinking, all right, what are my fundamental needs right now?
Hmm.
And then so now I always start with emotion because emotions are really obvious. We feel them, we hear them. And what I find is that emotion oftentimes we don't allow it to do its work.
Right.
And I think of the work of emotions being like they're like a flag that needs are down there waving like a big flag. And the emotions can guide us down to what really matters to us, to these needs and interests. If we're conscious of thinking, okay, whoo, I'm furious right now. All right, why am I furious? What is it that, I care about here? What do I really need? So the emotions are all of the ways that that we experience the world. They give us their signals about what matters to us, what we've experienced, what we need. And needs are these fundamental things. You mentioned Maslow's hierarchy. There's a lot of different kinds of needs. There's fundamental needs like food, and then there's all kinds of needs like contribution is a big one, or autonomy, or safety, or community. There's so many things that exist on a really fundamental level, and my needs are never in conflict with your needs. It's the strategies that we choose that get in conflict. And then on the interest level, what I call interests are is kind of the level of how these things show up in our situations. So what we're basically looking for in a situation. So the difference between, I let's say I really have a need for autonomy, and I'm finding that I can't get out and go to work. I can't get to. So I decide that I need some kind of reliable transportation. So the autonomy is a need. Transportation, reliable transportation, is the interest, and that it doesn't yet hold a specific strategy. So then I might pick a strategy. I need a new car. I need a bus pass. But a strategy is different than an interest. And oftentimes we jump straight up to the strategy, and then I say to you, "We have to buy a new car." And you say, "Well, we don't have any money." "No, I need a car." "You know what? You don't want to have autonomy?" Then we start fighting, having unnecessary conflicts arise because we're not getting to that level of what matters. I need more autonomy. I need some kind of transportation that's reliable. So those 4 elements are always in play, and they're always part of the conversation, and the more we have the capacity to really differentiate between them, and then to consciously direct our attention, and especially if we find ourselves suddenly in a conflict where everybody's just fighting about strategies, we don't need to all be on the same page and have taken the same conflict resolution course or something like that, or use some kind of formula. But if I can switch my own attention from strategies down to interests, then it's easier for everybody else too, because especially if I become curious about the other people's interests and say, "Okay, so yeah, what are your concerns around that?" Or, "What are you really looking for in this situation?" Then then we're in a different area. We're in a different landscape where there's way, way more possibility available to us.
I couldn't help but think about the idea of vulnerability throughout this whole
Mhm.
thing you were just discussing. The elements um the willingness to be vulnerable seems paradoxical to the idea of conflict. It's almost like you feel like you need to put your guard up, but if you put your guard, that's invulnerable as opposed to vulnerable. If some, do you think that putting those elements, like putting the cart before the horse, basically, the idea of I need my interest before, like mixing those things up, is a form of kind of safeguarding or boundary building that removes vulnerability from the equation? And
Hmm.
to dovetail on that, um, steps to allowing yourself to be vulnerable in these situations. What are some things that people can do? Because again, you hear the term conflict, and I don't think people think, oh, you know what, I need to be open here as opposed to guarded.
Yeah. So clearly there's many situations where it's not appropriate to get into talking about deep needs. It
Sure.
just isn't the right thing. And you certainly don't want to put yourself in any kind of a danger in a situation. So sometimes I think about it at like a detective. So a detective looks to find out what's going on, and that's what you can do in a conflict. So that's why the level of interest can be really helpful because that's a place where people can be pretty comfortable. I can say I need reliable, transportation, or I'm looking for a workplace where we're able to have a back and forth, or when issues come up, or whatever it is.
Mhm.
So it's not necessary to lay yourself out flat in a vulnerable and a dangerous way, but rather to keep a curiosity that allows you to see where you actually are, as opposed to shutting down so that you only have a little narrow path that you've decided is the right way. But then you're missing all kind of information, and you're much less likely to find a way forward that's actually going to be of benefit to you and the other person as you go forward. So oftentimes there is a fear of like, well, I don't even want to talk to this person, much less tell them what I care about. But the thing is that everybody in a conflict is in the conflict because something matters to them. So when we approach it, and again, not in kind of a martyr like way, but in a detective kind of a way of trying to figure out what's going on and what matters, then we open up a space that without over vulnerabilizing, if we could say,
Sure.
allows us to allows us to figure out what are the components of the situation. And this can be simple questions like, okay, I think I might not be understanding what everything that's going on here. Can you tell me what really matters to you in this? Okay, and here's what really matters to me in this. That's a level that is speaking to interests without getting into uncomfortable territory for the most part. And if people are arguing about strategies, you can also say, okay, so it sounds like X makes sense to you. What will that help with for you? So then that gets down to the why, the interest, without getting too weird about it for
Right.
people. And
Well,
without also denying their strategy because they're gonna hang on to that. What will that help with? Oh, okay, so you're looking for this and this. Yeah.
it's interesting because it dovetails nicely into the idea of requests versus, when complaints and
Yeah.
demands are, because I mean, I think that 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 area, because we live, we're kind of in this world where it rewards reactivity and speed, right? And
Mhm.
so complaints and demands often are very, they seem very, this is the way forward. Like, this is my problem, fix it. Or this is what I
Yeah.
want, do it. As opposed to, again, you brought up curiosity, which is questioning. Requests is kind of like a version of that. Can we dive into that a little bit? Because when I was
Yeah.
going through that part of the book, it, I mean, you can see it. Like, even in the in the book, it's I'm so sick of cooking, and then the request is much longer. Like, it takes longer to get that out. The demand: stop fighting. Your kids are you kids are driving me crazy. Demand blame. The longer it takes more time to do that. So how do you create the space that allows for that to take place?
Yeah. So if I'm coming at you with a demand, I've created increased urgency, and I've created a very tight space. If I say, "You have to do this," then I put you in a situation where you have 2 options. You can comply with me or you can defy me. So we've already set up this charged situation where there is no space.
Right.
If I take a step back, and a request, as I see it, is like a fishing line that you're throwing out an idea from you're staying over here with yourself, what matters to you, and you're finding out what the other person is willing and not willing to do so that you can find out why. So for me, a real request is is something that you're okay with the person saying no to.
Mhm.
So if I take a step back and say, if I say, "Oh my god, I'm so sick of doing the dishes. You never do it. What the hell?" Then I've tightened it up. But if I say, "I'm finding myself getting really frustrated with the way we're dividing up the household tasks. I feel like I'm doing more than feels equal, and I'd love to have a conversation about that. Could we talk about that?" I've slowed it down. I've opened the space up, and I've opened a space up for you to let me know what you're thinking, around this. So the more that I can open up a space that says, "Here's my frustration. Here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I care about. I want to better understand what you're thinking. Can we talk about this?" It's kind of like putting the brakes on internally and also between you. And so even though it seems like it would take longer, it's already slowed things down enough that there's a space for interaction as opposed to reactivity.
It is fascinating to me how much, when we live in a world that kind of asks us to move forward quickly,
Mm,
talking overrides listening. And
mhm,
I also have a performance background as an
hmm,
improviser,
okay.
and improv doesn't work unless you're listening.
Yeah,
You can bend the rules of improv to kind of go the way that you want them to go, but yes and following the rules, for lack of a better term, and you have to follow those rules before you can before you can bend them and maybe even break them because you know them so well. In the book, I mean, one of the things you say, and again, this is around the decisions. What mindset am I practicing? Right before that, I think is where we were talking about where I saw the listening piece. The idea of, oh, here it is: engage the action of listening, especially when you don't want to. So
yeah,
that last part. Tips on
yeah.
how to do it even when you don't want to, because you later say what you practice is what you do. So how do you, again, for lack of better, short circuit this, I'm going to talk instead of listening.
Yeah. I think the improv thing is a good example, is that if I'm in an improv with you and I'm not listening to you, then I'm not using the materials that are in the room. And so whatever I bring up won't be involved with the room. And so to start to really develop that mindset in yourself of recognizing, if I don't know what's up with the other person, I'm missing the materials of the present. I'm missing what this situation is made of. And then I'm going to be creating solutions that only work for me, but they won't work for me because they won't work for the other person. So I think there's a broader kind of a mindset of this curiosity that recognizes that in order for something to move forward productively, we need to have the information from all sides. And so when you find yourself really wanting to shut down and just you're sick of that person, you don't want to hear it, you feel like you've heard it all the time in yourself. And sometimes I think your body can really help you. You can, if you find yourself kind of like hunkering down internally, to just literally physically open up to a space of curiosity and think, what don't I know yet?
Right.
What might happen here? What might be possible that I haven't yet noticed? That becomes your default first mental action to ask, what might be possible that I haven't noticed? What information am I missing? What can I ask this person to better understand the situation? So listening, what we tend to do is we start to rehearse our own position in advance. We start to interrupt them, jump on top of them, psychoanalyze them, tell them what's wrong with them. All of those things make it really hard for the person to give us information and for us to receive information. So to think about it as kind of like in an improv, that if I don't listen to you, I can't respond to you. I can
Right.
only speechify at you, which won't be rich and it won't be fulfilling. Yeah.
And the audience will go, "What happened here?" Like it as weird as
Yeah.
it sounds, because people will watch shows like Whose Line Is It Anyway, and they go, "Oh, they're amazing. It's seamless. It's so," like, yeah, they're edited together. Like there are so many times where it didn't work that you don't get to see it. And you can tell when, you're at an improvisational comedy show, or even just, I mean, any improv show like Harold's or anything like that, especially Harold's. If you aren't following the thread, the audience, like the impact is so much lower because if you walk on and start doing a Christopher Walken impression with no rhyme or reason, because you
Mhm.
know that you can do that and it's a strength that you have, but it doesn't serve the scene, then it's not serving the ultimate outcome that you want. So
Yeah.
I want to kind of circle back to the 20 decisions, because people are going to look at as they're going through the book and they go through each decision, and we're not going to cover them all today. We don't have time for that. Plus, we want people to pick up the book. Uh, how do you keep people? First off, I guess the first question is do they need to approach these 20 decisions as almost like a checklist initially to kind of get used to kind of using conflict as an opportunity? If so, how do they do that? And if not, how do they keep themselves from doing that? Especially people listening to this podcast who are all, have a propensity to go, I want to check off all these boxes.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So my approach generally is non-formulaic, and this book is organized in such a way that it is a way to illuminate these decisions that we're already making. So these 20 decisions, we're already making each of them in every conflict. So it's a practice of awareness. And, you might wanna go through initially as you increase your own awareness of like, "Oh, right. Am I making a request or am I making demands? What are all the different things that you can look at in there?" So it's less of a checklist and more of a growing capacity for awareness of consciously deciding how you're approaching, relationships, work situations, projects, your culture, your community, and, so for me, the book can be used in a number of different ways. It can be really helpful if you are preparing, let's say, for a difficult conversation. You might look at those 20 ones and notice, oh God, I haven't even thought about that yet. Okay, what am I consciously choosing there? So that you can use, just the list to figure
Mhm.
out where you don't have consciousness yet. And then the more you get used to doing that, the more easily your mind will consciously shape how you're paying attention when you're stressed out. Because what you practice, like you mentioned before, is what you'll do when you're really stressed out. You'll default to the things you've done the most. So the more you get used to kind of directing your attention to the level of interest, to what is a real request, who is really involved in this conflict, what are the processes that are happening here? What are my habits? How am I responding when that habit comes up? What habits did the other person have? What habits do we have together? Um, and then another way to practice can be really helpful is to look back over past conflicts and kind of go through those decisions and notice which decisions were made, because there will always have been a decision made in every one of those 20 decisions categories. And that can be a way to really start illuminating, oh, wow, yeah, this is really a multifaceted situation and conflict. This is not, we get in there and it's so stressful sometimes it just feels like a monolith of blocked up stress. But in fact, it's a mobile situation where decisions are being made left and right, and we are always part of it. And we have a power to be able to expand our capacity to see, to move consciously, also to build power together with the person that we're in conflict with. That's a possibility that doesn't really, jump up to our minds immediately. But the more we adopt this kind of detective curiosity mindset, a real willingness to listen to what's up with the other person and to notice that unless we have the information from all sides and unless we're really conscious of these decisions, then we're just going to slam through in a habitual way that might not serve us as we want it to. So the book is there as a handbook.
I love how couple things. Number one, detectives never just solve one mystery. So it's an ongoing thing. It's not like,
It's a
all right,
practice.
yeah, it's not, yeah, exactly. And secondly, I talk about these things called the spheres of attention: noticing, awareness, focus, and concentration. And they kind of,
Mm,
go in. And you've brought up noticing, awareness, and then what I saw in the book is that those decisions heighten, like allow you to go deeper into the fears to focus and even concentration. But it
Mm,
oscillates, right? Like, I mean, you're not going to
yeah.
stay in one area for very long. And noticing is the wider scope. So for those that are listening, uh, if you've noticed, and invariably most people have, that conflict has arisen in your life and you want to be able to, handle it, and you want to become aware of what you can do to this, what you've put together is a nice guidebook. Plus, you've also got some strategies in here. We talked about strategies earlier, about these power sources that you discuss at the
Mhm.
tail end of the book, which kind of like, the eight, they're called the eight power sources, and how, again, where you can derive power from. So can we touch on those as we get close to wrapping up our conversation today? Can you tell me
Yeah.
which ones, first off, where have they been useful for you maybe which one do you find yourself tapping into the most when you're dealing with conflict? And secondly, again, it's as I was going through them, you alluded to this already. You're probably already tapping into them anyway. You're just kind of heightening the attention around them so that you can leverage them better.
Yeah. And power sources are mobile. They're the results of relationships too. People endorse the power we have. If I have food and you're hungry, then you endorse the power that I have to help you with your need for hunger. So all of these things, there can be conflict that can arise, and in many areas, obviously. And what I find often in business is that there can be unclarity around roles and processes. And so, really building up the capacity to have clarity around what processes are in place is a kind of power, and to be able to consciously craft processes and systems and positional power to recognize how positional power is being used. Personal power, there's so many different kinds of it that can help us to communicate, to inspire each other, to act with integrity is a type of power. And then to really recognize that the intelligence, the many different kinds that we have, the many different kinds the other person has, can help us have conversations. So if we know that let's say I'm an emotional person, or I have the capacity to really work with emotion, and the other person has a capacity to really work logically. And sometimes conflict has arisen because we haven't understood each other, kind of like you mentioned with your wife and
Yep.
that. Then we can also recognize that. I can recognize this other person has this very logical approach, and that can be something that can help us build on. We can build together so that power is not a zero sum thing. If I have power, you don't have power.
Right.
Everybody has power of some kind. And the more conscious we are of it, the more we can work with it.
But
And
it's
also,
like
we can recognize. Sorry, go
right,
ahead.
but it's like the force too. It can be used for good or it could be used for evil. We Before we hit
Yes.
record, we talked about a certain conversation which we're not going to reveal here on the podcast, but where one person could clearly handle conflict in a way based on what they knew about the person on the other end of the conversation, to kind of make sure that it didn't blow up or become some big spectacle. Instead, it appeared to be something, timid's probably not the right word, but more professional, polite, even reserved. And yet, if they didn't deal with it if they ignored that or weren't aware, like you pointed out, then it could have gone in a completely different direction.
Yeah. And I was just thinking also as you're talking there that because the book, for example, has these 20 different things, there's these many different power sources. At first, it can feel like, oh my God, how am I ever going to keep track of all that stuff? And it
Yeah.
would take forever. But it's like, so I come from a dance background,
Hmm.
and dancers train for decades and decades. And you train so that you can tell without even looking, you can tell if your leg is straight or how much it's bent. And at first, it takes a long time to recognize. You have to look in the mirror, like, oh my God, my shoulder's still up. Okay, or my shoulder down. But eventually, it becomes a natural part of the way you think. And all of this does too. So the more you become conscious of, okay, these things are always in place. They're already there. It doesn't matter if I want to pay attention to them or not. They're happening. So I can either choose to pay attention, and then I can increase my capacity to respond in the ways that I want to, and to be with the people in the world in the ways that I want to, because I can actively choose those decisions. then it kind of comes together, synthesizes into a mindset that's not formulaic and it's not something external to you. It's you and the way you look at the world.
Last question I have for you, because as I was going through the book and as I was thinking about this during our conversation, I couldn't help but think journaling has to be something that would be really powerful to help with the idea of handling, navigating, even seeing conflict as an opportunity. First off, do you practice journaling? And secondly, do you think it would be a helpful exercise for people who are, especially when we're talking about those spheres, noticing, awareness, so on and so forth, to heighten and maybe have this stuff kind of, for lack of a term, become more natural or um, become more uh, observed or even utilized because you're keeping that awareness heightened. Do you find that journaling could be a role that or a tool rather that could help with that? And do you journal yourself?
I realized yesterday that I do journal in a certain way, which when I teach, I always write down what happened and what I've learned in the process of that course.
Hmm.
Um, and I realized that I do that there, and it's very helpful for me then because I come back next time I teach the course and I see, oh, right, last time that happened, here's what I learned. And I find it very useful for people who are studying conflict and working with conflict to write things down because it not only does it concretize it, but it gives it a little external place to be. And then you can look at it and you can, for example, say, okay, all right, I'm going to write down what I want to say to that person. And then you can look at it and you can say, all right, is there any attack in there? Is there defensiveness? Is there some kind of an alienating force?
Yeah.
And if you really look honestly, you can be like, yeah, I'm actually sneaking some of that in there. Okay, let
Especially
me
if you
try that.
especially if you dictate it, right? Like imagine doing voice dictation, you could probably hear it
Right.
in your tone of voice too, right?
Yeah. And there's also, in a certain way, there's a physical way of journaling, which is when you can practice saying it out loud, like you say, and then you could notice what's happened to your body. Am I like tightening way down? Am I getting super aggressive and moving forward? Or am I feeling really expansive physically as I say this? So that you can look at what you're doing and then make conscious decisions about if it's what you want to be doing or not. And then choose differently and then practice that so that it becomes first nature. It becomes just the way you think because the way you think is not a fixed thing. It's something that you're developing and you're shaping through the things that you do every day and the way you speak to people and the way you think about yourself and the world.
Dana, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time. The book is called Conflict is an Opportunity: 20 Fundamental Decisions for Navigating Difficult Times. Where can people keep up with your work and where can people pick up the book?
Hmm. You can follow me on at danacaspersen.com. That's Caspersen, SEN.com. I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram, Facebook, and you can get the book in all at every bookseller where you normally get your book or at Roman and Littlefield. I'm also coming out soon with a practice book that works adjacent to this. It has additional exercises that people can use or teachers could use if they want to use the book in a course, for example. And I'm creating cards that have, for example, the decisions and little ideas on the back. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to those. Those are coming out soon.
Excellent. Dana, thanks so much for having a productive conversation with me today.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks to Dana for joining me on the program. You can find all of the show notes, not only where you're listening to this podcast right now, but also at mikevardy.com/podcast 610. Now, wherever you're listening to this right now, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, even YouTube, subscribe to the show. That way you won't miss a single episode of what's to come. And we've already produced 610 episodes, and there's no stopping us or slowing us down. We've got stuff coming all the way through the summer, or if you're joining us and it's another time of year round, we've got you covered here on A Productive Conversation. Subscribing to the show is one way to support the show. Another way to support the show is to rate and review, leave comments wherever you're getting this podcast. It just will help us make the show better. And if you like this episode, don't forget to rate and review the episode wherever you are getting this podcast as well. And if you're checking this out on Spotify or YouTube, leave a comment, share your insights. I'd love to hear what you have to say. That's it for this episode. Until next time, I'm Mike Vardy, the host of A Productive Conversation, reminding you to stop doing productive and start being productive. See you later.